Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to step into a world where life moved slower, neighbors knew each other's names, and an entire state seemed to hum with possibility? There's something about Texas in 1977 that captures a particular moment in American history. The oil was flowing, the economy was booming, the cities were growing at a pace that seemed unstoppable. And if someone lived through it in Texas, they know exactly what made that year so extraordinary. This was not just another year in the Lone Star State. This was the year Texas was proving it could be more than cattle and oil fields. Houston was becoming a global energy capital. Dallas was home to the biggest television show in America. Austin was quietly transforming into a music destination. And across the state, ordinary Texans were living through changes that would define the Texas we know today. 1977 gave us the Dallas Cowboys winning their first Super Bowl. It gave us the opening of the Astrodome roof for Pope John Paul II's visit. It gave us a year when gas was still affordable, when a middle-class family could buy a house on a single income, and when Texas still felt like a place where anyone could build something from nothing. The optimism was real, the opportunities were tangible, and Texas felt like it was just getting started. Living in Texas in 1977 meant being part of a state that was changing faster than almost anywhere else in America. Let us walk through what daily life actually felt like during that remarkable year. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why people were moving to Texas by the thousands. Let us step into that world. Living in Texas in 1977 meant waking up to a state that was in the middle of an economic boom that seemed like it would never end. The oil crisis of 1973 had actually benefited Texas. While the rest of America struggled with high energy prices, Texas was producing the oil and natural gas that the country desperately needed. The oil fields in West Texas, the Gulf Coast refineries, and the energy companies headquartered in Houston were printing money. Houston was exploding. The population was growing so fast that new subdivisions were being built constantly. The city was adding tens of thousands of jobs every year. Energy companies from around the world were opening offices in Houston. The skyline was changing almost monthly as new office towers went up. Living in Houston in 1977 meant feeling like you were at the center of global energy. The wealth was visible everywhere. New shopping malls, expensive restaurants, luxury car dealerships selling cars as fast as they could get them. Houston had a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and in 1977 it felt deserved. Dallas had its own brand of success. The television show Dallas had premiered in April of 1978, but the city's reputation was already established in 1977. This was a city of money and ambition. The banking industry was massive. Real estate development was booming. North Dallas was becoming synonymous with wealth. The Cowboys were America's team, and winning Super Bowl XII in January 1978 for the 1977 season only confirmed what Dallas already believed about itself. Austin in 1977 was still a relatively small city, but it was beginning its transformation into something unique. The University of Texas dominated the town. Sixth Street was becoming a music destination. Willie Nelson had moved to Austin and was part of the outlaw country movement that made Austin the center of a new kind of Texas music. The city had a laid-back vibe that was completely different from Houston's corporate energy or Dallas's polished ambition. San Antonio maintained its distinct character. The military bases were enormous employers. The Alamo remained the heart of the city's identity. The Riverwalk was a major tourist attraction. San Antonio felt more connected to its Mexican heritage than the other major Texas cities. The food was different. The culture was different. The pace was slower. The smaller cities and towns across Texas were experiencing their own version of the boom. Midland and Odessa were oil towns where roughnecks could make serious money. Lubbock was the heart of cotton country and Texas Tech football. Amarillo sat on the high plains where cattle ranching was still a way of life. Corpus Christi was the Gulf Coast city where the beach met the oil industry. Each of these places had its own economy, its own culture, its own version of what it meant to be Texan in 1977. What most people do not know is that 1977 was the year Texas experienced one of its worst droughts in decades. Yet the economy was so strong that it barely seemed to matter. Water restrictions were in place across much of the state, but construction continued. Lawns might have been brown, but new houses kept going up. The housing market in Texas in 1977 was completely different from today. Houses were affordable. A nice three-bedroom house in a good Houston suburb could be purchased for $30,000. The same house in Dallas might cost $35,000. In smaller cities, houses were even cheaper. These were not tiny houses either. These were substantial homes with big yards, multiple bathrooms, and garages that could fit the enormous cars everyone was driving. The interest rates were higher than they had been earlier in the decade, but mortgages were still accessible for middle-class families. A man working in the oil industry or at one of the defense contractors could support a family, buy a house, and still have money left over. This was before credit cards became ubiquitous. People paid cash for most things or used layaway. Debt was something to be avoided, not a normal part of life. Inside Texas homes in 1977, the aesthetic was earth tones and wood paneling. Brown, orange, and harvest gold were the dominant colors. Shag carpeting was still popular, though it was beginning to fall out of fashion. Avocado green appliances were common in kitchens. The furniture was heavy and substantial. Velour couches, wood grain entertainment centers that held the television and stereo system. The television was the center of family life. In 1977, there were still only 3 major networks. Families watched the same shows because there were limited options. Saturday nights might mean watching The Love Boat or Fantasy Island. Sundays were for football. Watching the Cowboys on television was a ritual for millions of Texas families. The television itself was a massive piece of furniture. Color televisions were standard by 1977, but they were big, heavy boxes that dominated whatever room they were in. The car culture in Texas in 1977 was absolutely central to daily life. Texas had been built around the automobile, and 1977 was when that relationship was at its peak. The cars were enormous. Full-size sedans from Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler were everywhere. Station wagons with wood paneling were the family vehicle of choice. These cars were not fuel efficient, but gas was cheap enough that it did not matter much. Pickup trucks were already a huge part of Texas culture. The Ford F-150, Chevrolet Silverado, and Dodge Ram were not just work vehicles. They were status symbols. A man might drive his pickup truck to his white-collar job, and no one thought twice about it. Pickup trucks represented independence and practicality in equal measure. The trucks in 1977 were simple compared to modern vehicles. Manual transmissions were common. Air conditioning was an option, not a standard feature. Power windows and power locks were luxuries. Muscle cars were still around in 1977, though the era of the high-performance muscle car was ending. Emissions regulations and fuel economy standards were forcing manufacturers to reduce engine sizes and horsepower. A 1977 Pontiac Trans Am with the big block engine was one of the last of its kind. Young men who could afford one treasured it. The Smokey and the Bandit film released in 1977 made the black and gold Trans Am an icon. Gas stations were different in 1977. Full service was still common. An attendant would pump your gas, check your oil, and clean your windshield. Gas was around 65 cents per gallon, which seemed expensive compared to a few years earlier but was manageable. The gas lines of 1973 were a memory, but they had changed how Americans thought about fuel. Driving across Texas in 1977 meant experiencing distances that people from other states could not quite comprehend. Dallas to El Paso was more than 600 miles. Houston to Amarillo was even farther. The highways were good, but they were not yet the massive interstate system we have today. 2-lane highways connected many smaller towns. Driving at night meant long stretches of darkness with nothing but your headlights and the radio. One fact that surprises people is that the speed limit in Texas in 1977 was 55 miles per hour. This was due to the national mandate imposed after the oil crisis to save fuel. Texans hated it. The state was built for speed and distance, and driving 55 on an empty West Texas highway felt like an insult. Many people ignored the speed limit, and enforcement was inconsistent. The music scene in Texas in 1977 was producing some of the most important American music of the era. The outlaw country movement was in full swing. Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and Jerry Jeff Walker were creating music that rejected the polished Nashville sound in favor of something rawer and more authentic. Austin was the center of this movement. The Armadillo World Headquarters was the venue where this music thrived. It was a converted National Guard armory that became legendary for its concerts. Willie Nelson's album Stardust would not be released until 1978, but in 1977 he was already a superstar. His 4th of July picnic concerts had become major events that drew tens of thousands of fans. These were not polished arena shows. They were outdoor gatherings where people camped, drank beer, and listened to music for days. Country music was not the only sound coming out of Texas. ZZ Top was at the peak of their popularity. The band from Houston had a blues rock sound that was distinctly Texan. Their concerts were massive productions with elaborate stage setups. The members were known for their long beards and dark sunglasses, creating an image that was both mysterious and very Texas. Houston also had a thriving soul and blues scene that most people outside Texas did not know about. Clubs in the 3rd Ward and 5th Ward featured musicians who would influence generations. These were small venues where the music was raw and powerful. Tejano music was huge in South Texas and San Antonio. This was music that blended Mexican traditional styles with American influences. Conjunto music with accordions and bajo sextos was the sound of working-class Mexican-American communities. Little Joey La Familia and other Tejano acts were playing to packed audiences, though they received almost no attention from mainstream media. The food culture in Texas in 1977 reflected the state's diversity and its confidence in its own traditions. Barbecue was already an obsession. Every region had its own style. East Texas barbecue was different from Central Texas, which was different from South Texas. The debates about which style was best were serious business. Barbecue joints were not fancy restaurants. They were often simple buildings, sometimes just a shack with a smoker out back. The meat was served on butcher paper with white bread and pickles. Sauce was optional and often looked down upon by purists who believed good barbecue did not need it. Franklin Barbecue in Austin would not exist for decades, but the traditions it would build on were thriving in 1977. Tex-Mex food was everywhere, but it was not called Tex-Mex yet. It was just Mexican food, though it was a style unique to Texas. Enchiladas covered in chili and cheese, crispy tacos with ground beef, refried beans and Spanish rice, cheese dip, which Texans called queso, was a standard appetizer. Restaurants like El Fenix in Dallas and Mi Tierra in San Antonio had been around for decades and were institutions. Chicken fried steak was a staple. This was a dish that took a cheap cut of beef, pounded it flat, breaded it, fried it, and covered it in cream gravy. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, it was the kind of meal that defined Texas comfort food. Diners and cafeterias across the state served it daily. Whataburger was expanding across Texas in 1977. Founded in Corpus Christi in 1950, by 1977 it was becoming a Texas institution. The burgers were big. The orange and white striped buildings were distinctive. Ordering a Whataburger with cheese and jalapenos was a Texas experience. The restaurants were open 24 hours, making them gathering places for teenagers and night shift workers. One food fact that might surprise people is that Chinese-American restaurants were extremely popular in Texas in 1977, particularly in smaller towns. These were not authentic Chinese restaurants. They served Americanized versions of Chinese food, sweet and sour pork, egg rolls, fried rice, but they were beloved. Many small Texas towns had a Chinese restaurant that had been run by the same family for generations. The economy of Texas in 1977 was driven by several major industries beyond oil and gas. The defense industry was massive. Military bases were spread across the state. Fort Hood near Killeen was one of the largest military installations in the world. Fort Bliss in El Paso, Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, and numerous other installations employed tens of thousands of military personnel and civilian workers. Aerospace was huge in Houston. NASA's Johnson Space Center was the center of the space program. In 1977, the shuttle program was in development. Engineers and scientists from around the world worked in Houston. The space program had a prestige that attracted the best and brightest. Working for NASA was a dream job. Agriculture was still a major part of the Texas economy. Cotton in the Panhandle and West Texas. Cattle ranching across the state. Rice farming along the Gulf Coast. The King Ranch in South Texas was still one of the largest ranches in the world. Farming and ranching were not just economic activities. They were tied to Texas identity. The banking industry in Texas was powerful and loosely regulated compared to other states. Texas banks could not branch across state lines, but they were expanding rapidly within Texas. The oil boom meant banks had money to lend, and they were lending aggressively for real estate development, business expansion, and personal consumption. The education system in Texas in 1977 was experiencing significant changes. School integration was still being implemented in many districts. Busing programs were controversial. Some districts were complying with federal orders, others were resisting. The quality of education varied wildly depending on where you lived. Wealthy suburban districts had excellent schools with new facilities. Rural districts and poor urban districts struggled with outdated buildings and limited resources. The University of Texas at Austin was already a major research university. Texas A&M was the agricultural and military school with deep traditions. Both schools had massive enrollments and fierce football rivalries. The Thanksgiving game between Texas and Texas A&M was one of the biggest sporting events in the state. High school football was nearly as important. Friday night lights were not just a saying, they were a reality. Small towns across Texas emptied out on Friday nights as everyone went to the football game. The football field was where the community gathered, where social hierarchies were established, where young men could become heroes. One surprising aspect of Texas life in 1977 was how racially segregated many parts of the state still were. Legal segregation had ended, but social segregation remained. White Texans and black Texans often lived in different neighborhoods, went to different churches, and socialized in different spaces. Mexican Americans faced their own forms of discrimination, particularly in South Texas and along the border. Yet there were also moments of progress. Barbara Jordan, the congresswoman from Houston, was a national figure and the first black woman elected to Congress from the South. She had given the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention in 1976 and was widely respected. Henry B. Gonzalez represented San Antonio in Congress and was a powerful advocate for civil rights. The political culture in Texas in 1977 was still dominated by Democrats, though that was beginning to change. Texas had not voted for a Republican presidential candidate since Reconstruction until Eisenhower in the 1950s. The state was conservative, but conservative Democrats controlled the state legislature and most local offices. The Republican Party was growing, particularly in the suburbs of Dallas and Houston, but it had not yet taken over. The oil industry shaped politics in ways that are hard to overstate. Oil money funded campaigns. Oil executives had direct access to politicians. Regulations that might hurt the oil industry were dead on arrival. The Railroad Commission, which regulated oil and gas production, was one of the most powerful bodies in state government. The entertainment culture in Texas in 1977 was a mix of national trends and local traditions. Drive-in movie theaters were still popular. Families would load up the car with kids in pajamas, pay a few dollars, and watch a double feature from the comfort of their vehicle. The movies might be Star Wars, which was the biggest film of 1977, or Smokey and the Bandit, or one of the disaster films that were popular. Indoor movie theaters were often single-screen palaces in downtown areas, though multiplexes were beginning to appear in shopping malls. Going to the movies was a major event. People dressed up. There were no advance tickets or reserved seating. You showed up and hoped you got in. Bowling alleys were major social centers. Leagues met weekly. Families went bowling on weekends. The bowling alley had a snack bar, video games, and a distinctly 1970s atmosphere of cigarette smoke and the sound of pins falling. Roller rinks were everywhere. Roller disco was becoming a phenomenon. Kids and teenagers would spend entire afternoons skating in circles under disco balls and colored lights. The music was loud. The atmosphere was energetic. For young people, the roller rink was where you went to see and be seen. Shopping in Texas in 1977 meant going to the mall. The enclosed shopping mall was still a relatively new concept, but it was spreading fast. North Park Center in Dallas had opened in 1965 and was massive. The Galleria in Houston opened in 1970 and was modeled after a famous shopping arcade in Milan. These were not just places to shop. They were destinations. Families would spend entire Saturdays at the mall. The mall had department stores like Neiman Marcus, Foley's, and Sears. It had specialty shops. It had a food court. It had air conditioning, which in Texas summer made it a refuge. Downtown shopping districts were declining. As malls grew in the suburbs, the old department stores downtown were struggling. The pattern of white flight that affected cities across America was happening in Texas, too. Middle-class families were moving to the suburbs. Downtowns were left with office buildings that emptied out after 5 o'clock. The heat in Texas in 1977 shaped daily life in ways that people who have never experienced a Texas summer cannot quite understand. Summer temperatures routinely exceeded 100 degrees. The humidity along the Gulf Coast made it feel even hotter. Air conditioning was not yet universal, though it was common. Older homes might have window units or attic fans. Newer homes had central air conditioning, which was becoming standard. People adjusted their lives around the heat. Outdoor activities happened early in the morning or late in the evening. The middle of the day was for staying inside. Swimming pools were not luxuries in Texas, they were necessities. Backyard pools were common in middle-class neighborhoods. Public pools were packed all summer. The heat also meant that Texas architecture was different from the rest of the country. Homes had covered porches. Trees were planted strategically for shade. Light-colored roofs reflected heat. What many people do not realize is that 1977 was the year of a massive ice storm that hit North Texas in February. Dallas and Fort Worth experienced freezing rain that coated everything in ice. Power lines came down. Roads were impassable. Texans, who were accustomed to heat but not ice, were completely unprepared. The city shut down for days. It was a reminder that Texas weather could be extreme in any direction. Life in Texas in 1977 was not perfect. The boom economy masked some serious problems. Income inequality was growing. The wealth being generated by oil was not being distributed evenly. The schools in poor districts were falling further behind. Pollution was a major issue. Houston's air quality was terrible. The petrochemical plants along the Gulf Coast were dumping toxins into the air and water with minimal regulation. The border with Mexico was already a complicated issue. Immigration was increasing. The Border Patrol was active, but the border was porous. Mexican workers crossed legally and illegally to work in agriculture, construction, and service industries. The relationship between Texas and Mexico was economically important but politically sensitive. Crime was rising in Texas cities. Houston had a serious crime problem. The murder rate was high. Drugs were becoming more prevalent. Cocaine was the drug of the wealthy. Marijuana was common among young people. Heroin was a problem in poorer neighborhoods. Law enforcement was overwhelmed in some areas. Yet, despite these problems, the overall mood in Texas in 1977 was optimistic. The economy was strong, jobs were plentiful, the future seemed bright. People were moving to Texas from other states because they believed Texas offered opportunities they could not find elsewhere. That belief was largely justified. What defined Texas in 1977 was confidence. This was a state that believed in itself, that believed bigger was better, that believed Texas was special. The attitude was not subtle. Texans in 1977 were proud of being Texan in a way that people from other states found either charming or obnoxious. The bumper stickers and t-shirts that said "Don't mess with Texas" would not appear until the 1980s as part of an anti-littering campaign, but the attitude was already there. Texas had its own version of everything. Its own music, its own food, its own way of talking, its own sense of history. And in 1977, Texas was proving that its way worked. For those who lived in Texas in 1977, it was a year that felt like the state was hitting its stride. The Cowboys won the Super Bowl, the economy was booming, the cities were growing, the future looked wide open, the heat was intense, the distances were vast, and the confidence was unshakable. Texas in 1977 was a place where you could still build something from nothing, where hard work was rewarded, where the American dream felt tangible. The traffic was not yet terrible. Housing was affordable, jobs were available. For those with memories of this remarkable year in the Lone Star State, it represents a time when Texas felt unstoppable. If this look back at Texas in 1977 brought back memories or helped you understand what made that year special, consider subscribing to explore more stories about how Americans really lived in different decades and different places. There are so many more moments in history worth revisiting. And if you have your own memories of Texas in 1977, or if your family has stories from that era, leave a comment below. What do you remember most about that year? What has changed? What has stayed the same? Your stories help keep this history alive.